So I saw a few posts actually from our buddy Elliot Clough. He sent out a poll that said something like Caitlin Clark is the greatest athlete in the history of Iowa sports. And I think his two selections were yes and yes, basically making a point that she is the greatest athlete in the history of the University of Iowa.
What are you going to say, Mark? Go ahead and say what
Okay,
you're going
what
to
I'm
say.
about to say is number one, I'm not prepared to have the conversation that based on merit or accomplishments is she. I know that, correct me on his name if I get it wrong, because I haven't thought about him in years and years and years, but Dan Gable, correct. He is the Iowa wrestler of great fame from like 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Do I have that name correct? Anyway,
Go ahead.
Niall Kinnick. We could run down the number of great Iowa athletes throughout history. And Brian is telling me to watch it, Mark, because I think he knows where I'm headed on this. Here's my point: that while I'm not prepared to make my list of greatest athletes in Iowa history based on accomplishments, because I've not researched it, looked into it, thought about it, because I would want to do those things, I could spitball one that would be fairly close, but that's not my style. I like to be precise, like to get it right.
Real quick, just to make a correction, because you said it, I
Yes.
don't want to have you. People are going to start correcting us in the chat if we're not careful. Dan Gable wrestled at Iowa State, coached at Iowa.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm completely wrong on that then. My bad.
But no, I mean, I get your line of thinking. You're not bringing him up because we're not having the.
Yeah, for some reason I thought he was an Iowa wrestler. Okay, regardless, there would be candidates from all sports. Okay, if we are having the accomplishments argument that the greatest athlete is tied to the best accomplishments, then certainly she is either at the outset, at the very top of that list and argument, or she may be a slam dunk winner. I don't know that. However, I look at it this way as well. I think this argument can be made as well. And I'll start it out by saying I was asked several times when I was a father, still am a father, but when I was a father of two high school athletes, I was asked this a few times: who's a better athlete, your son or your daughter? And what do you think my response was?
You can't compare the two.
Perfect. My response was to give them a blank stare to say, basically, you can't compare male athletes and female athletes as athletes. There's no comparison.
But you also can I counter that for a second?
Sure.
You also can't compare a football athlete with a wrestler. Same sex, different sports. I don't think you can do that. So if we're talking about the greatest athletes in general, I think the implication there, the inference there is what you said earlier. We're comparing in their respective sports who has the who's more iconic, who's the greatest in their respective sport. So one is women's basketball, one's men's basketball, one's wrestling, one's football. Okay, who's more? And now you have the best of the best everywhere. Who's the most iconic, greatest accomplishments? I think that's where the argument would be made.
Okay. So I get your point that it's difficult to compare across sports.
It's
Okay.
impossible. It's impossible.
Well, it's difficult. It's not impossible. But I get your point. I understand your point. I agree with it to a large extent. I'm making the point that men are better athletes than women. So you can't compare the two. That's all there is to it. That's not debatable. So
You
my
sound
point
like
about my son and my daughter was I would give a blank stare to this individual. This happened 3 or 4 times. Who's a better athlete, your son or your daughter? Be like, are you kidding me? As an athlete.
yeah. So here's where we're going to have a debate because I think there's a difference between saying who's the better athlete and who is more athletic. There is a difference between those two terms.
Sure.
And
Yes. Who's more athletic?
an athlete encompasses also what you're competing at, what sport you're competing at with against. And Caitlin
Sure.
Clark is competing in women's basketball.
A golfer may not by definition be a great athlete, but be a great golfer.
Oh, but
Is
Tiger
that what
Woods
you're
is
telling me? They may not need to be athletic.
Tiger Woods is one of the greatest athletes of all time, in my opinion.
Sure,
But I
I
mean, like,
agree.
who's more athletic, Tiger Woods or Michael Jordan? Probably Michael Jordan. I mean, I would put my chips
Yes.
on Michael Jordan.
When I think of being an athlete, I think of speed, strength, leaping ability, all of those things. Being an athlete, what you have to do to be an athlete.
I think that's where we're in on different terms with this because a
I'm
lot of
not
those things.
comparing male and female athletes because there's no comparison between the two as athletes. There's not an
Well,
athletic
that's where we're
comparison.
not on the same page as it relates to the definition of athlete versus athletic. You're defining the word athletic to me, whereas you're saying that the word athletic is actually athlete to you.
And that's extremely close, correct? Athletic and athlete.
Yeah,
They are,
they are close. They are
yes.
close, but that's what I'm saying. They're different words because athlete takes on the sport, the game, all of that. Tiger Woods, do you think Tiger Woods is do you think he has some insane vertical? I doubt it. I don't think he's probably the quickest laterally. He doesn't need to be. Denny Hamlin, a tremendous
Yes, his
NASCAR,
sport does not require it.
right? Like John Daly, like is John Daly at literally the bottom of every list because he's fat and he smokes? Like he's a great athlete. He's not very athletic. He's not athletic, really. Well, I shouldn't say at all. That's not fair to him because you got to be athletic. You got to have athleticism to be able to be an
Again,
athlete.
there's no comparison between male athletes and female athletes, so we shouldn't compare them and say that somebody is the greatest athlete overall as a female with male athletes involved because it's not even close. It's not debatable. As in terms of being an athlete, doing athletic things.
Again, so not, you're making those two words synonymous, and I don't make those two words synonymous.
Well, good and goodness aren't the same word, but they come from the same core word and
Yeah.
definition.
So there's not they're not synonyms though, Mark. Are they synonyms? Do you think an athlete and athleticism, those are both nouns? Are those synonyms?
No, they are not synonyms.
So there are similarities there between the two
Yes,
words, but they're
large
not synonyms.
similarities.
There's no this is listen, I've heard that, and I'm not taking a stance on this either way, but I remember hearing. You remember when John McEnroe got torched for what he said a few years ago about Serena Williams?
Yes, I know something about it
So
because he
I'm
said he
gonna.
could beat her in tennis.
No,
Is
that
that what
wasn't
he
the point
said?
of what he said. He said like the top 100 men could beat Serena Williams in tennis, and he got ripped for it. And
I don't know if he's right or wrong. I know that when Chris Everett Lloyd,
I know, I know. I don't need to know about this thing from 40 years ago.
yeah,
Yes.
when she was the number one tennis player in the world, she was married to the like 500th male tennis player in the world that nobody cared about. But she was asked, "What happens when you two play?" And she's like, "Are you kidding me? We don't play because I can't compete with him. We volley,
That's called common sense, right? That's called yeah, exactly.
but I'm just making the statement." And I know it's not a popular one in today's age to tell the truth, to be truthful about things, but that's why I'm here is to tell the truth. And I refuse to compare male and female athletes because female athletes can't compare to male athletes when it comes to athleticism. That's why when somebody asked me the question, who's a better athlete, your son or your daughter? I would not insult my daughter to put her in that conversation, even though she accomplished more in high school as an athlete than my son did. But who's faster? Who can jump higher? Who's stronger? Who's all all the components and characteristics of being an athlete? Who is better? Well, he is.
And I agree with you. I agree with you. I'm simply saying my definition of athlete is not purely based on athleticism. That's all I'm
Okay.
saying. But I absolutely understand where you're coming from, and under the confines of the definition of the term in your mind, you're absolutely correct, and nobody can debate that. I mean, if you want to debate that, you can have the debate. I thought what John McEnroe said was there was nothing wrong with what John McEnroe said because it was factual. And he never said that Serena Williams wasn't the greatest tennis athlete. He simply said that she would get beaten by any of the top 100 players on the men's side or whatever, top 50. And that's probably correct. Now, you can't prove that unless it actually happened. But I would agree, like if Caitlin Clark went up in a one-on-one contest against Joe Wieskamp or any of the men who have played at Iowa over the past 10 years, yeah, at a one-on-one contest, I would almost guarantee you that the male athlete would win almost every time. But I do incorporate accomplishments, and I mentioned how iconic a person is in their respective sport, all those things. Because again, I could go back to wrestling and say, like, Spencer Lee. Spencer Lee is one of the greatest athletes in Iowa history. Part of that's because he was a 3-time national champion. He was dominant at Iowa throughout his time period. He was also a charismatic guy. Like, I know that we're talking about accomplishments and athleticism and whatnot, but I also think personality, a lot of this is so opinion based. Like, a personality is part of that, right? How Caitlin Clark carries herself is part of why people in Iowa love her, because she has an edge that no other women's college
Okay.
basketball player has had, and she backs up her talk with her game. So that's what I'm saying. I don't think you can compare Spencer Lee though to Luka Garza because they play different sports, and the measures of even athleticism would be different with those two athletes because they're different ends of the spectrum. They've trained for different things. One guy's 7 foot, one guy's 5'5", so
You're introducing, with the personality and all of that, the charisma, you're introducing a whole other component that I don't take into account when rating athletes.
well, that goes into how much someone is, how much someone is respected, how much someone is, I don't want to say immortalized. That's not the right word, but uh, their status as a legend of that program or that franchise, right?
Ty Cobb is arguably the greatest hitter of all time. Well, he's a racist jackass, jerk. That's
I'll
his
say this.
legacy as a person.
If you had to ask me who's the most athletic person of all time, I might say Usain Bolt. I mean, Usain Bolt would probably be in the conversation. Maybe Muhammad Ali. But like, what happens when Muhammad Ali steps on a basketball court with Michael Jordan? What happens when Michael Jordan steps in a boxing ring against Muhammad Ali? I mean, I think it's just pointless to have those conversations in general because it's apples to oranges any way you slice it.
I'm guessing that one of them would fare better outside of their sport than the other. Not They wouldn't be able to compete with the other, but they would probably do better. Somebody would show themselves to be more capable in another sport. Michael Jordan went and played baseball, played in the minor leagues. That's pretty exceptional.
Yeah, and I think for most people, LeBron James is an excellent example. A lot of people have wanted LeBron to play football because they think he'd be a great tight end. Maybe he would. I don't know. He's got a football body, so to speak, and we've seen guys cross over, have success. Michael Jordan had his. Well, I mean, a lot of guys have played baseball and played basketball, and Iowa. Look at Ben Keeter right now at Iowa. He's wrestling. He's a football player, and Addison Estringa. He's in line to be the starting tight end at Iowa here in a couple of years, and he was a Iowa baseball commit at one time. So there is some crossover from a skill and talent ability standpoint. Yes, I agree with that.
Mike 3883 is getting to the core of my argument.
Yeah, and I understand the argument. I understand.